In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.
Our Lady of the Most Holy Rosary.
Pray for us.
Saint Benedict.
Pray for us.
Saint Thomas More.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, good evening, and welcome to the first of our lectures here at St. Benedict Abbey, which we will be making in collaboration with the Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture and Thomas More College of Liberal Arts. Now, I say this is the first of our lectures, but that does not mean the first in a series, at least not the way I understand the word series. We will not be having lectures here on a regular basis, as in a series, nor do we have a schedule of future lectures already worked out, at least not lectures that will be given here. And I think Phil will speak more about this, but there are monthly lectures being given at Mercy Hall in Nashua, all by Joseph Pierce, and so therefore highly recommended. We here are not trying to fill a time slot. We're not trying to fill a quota of speakers within a given period. Our choice of lecture, beside being consonant with our concern for the restoration of Christian culture, the fullness of which, of course, is the restoration of Catholic culture, as I say, our choice of lecture, as I'm sure with all lectures sponsored by the Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture, will be based on excellence. The choosing of the lecturer that we will be doing will be a collaborative effort between myself and Phil. And therefore, I'm speaking for myself here because Phil would be too humble to add to this, but I will speak for myself and say that the choice of this evening's lecture was a no-brainer, if we're talking about excellence. Phil Lawler is eminently qualified to begin our lectures here. I'm sure most of you here know him, or if you don't know him, perhaps more significantly, you know of him. For those of you who do not know him and did not read that little blurb about him on the website, allow me to read that blurb for you now. Phil Lawler is the director of the Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture. He is editor of Catholic World News and is the author or editor of a dozen books on political and religious topics. His essays, book reviews, and editorial columns have appeared in over 100 newspapers around the United States and abroad, including the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. And before we begin, couple little practical things. First of all, there's a washroom right back there. There's another one down a little bit further, but there's one right there. And the second little practical thing is phones. Please turn off your phones. There we go. Okay, well, so with that introduction, let's get me off and let's get tonight's speaker on, Mr. Philip Lawler.
Thank you. It's a relief to be introduced by a friend as a no-brainer. My critics have something else in mind when they use that phrase. My critics, who are many. Seriously, I'm grateful to Abbot Mark and to our friends here at St. Benedict's Abbey for the opportunity to do some outreach for the Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture, trying to create a new constituency beyond the border. So many people don't feel that they can't come to an event that's in Massachusetts if they are in New Hampshire, or vice versa. It's really not that far. And if you've been here, if you've been on the site and registered, as I hope you did, and I think most of you did, you've had an opportunity to see something about the center, and you are also now trapped on our mailing list and will be informed about future events, and I hope you will sample them, and I hope you'll come up to Mercy Hall. It's a beautiful venue in Nashua, and see, for instance, Joseph Pierce, who's giving a series of lectures on the history of Christendom, a subject that we're touching on tonight. My idea for this evening's event actually came from an event that was held several years ago at St. Thomas More College, where Christopher Check, who's the president now of Catholic Answers, came and did what I'm going to do. He talked about Lepanto, and then he recited Lepanto. And it enriched my understanding of the poem to the extent that I went home and said, I need to memorize this so that I can do the same thing. Anyone who's inclined to do that tonight, get to it right away, because I can tell you your memory will not improve as you get older. But I think I'm glad I did it, because it enriches your understanding of the poem to memorize it as well as to recite it. I think poems are made to be heard, not just to be read. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about the story behind the poem, and then I'm going to run through the poem, sort of helping you to understand the game plan, the roadmap, and some of the unusual phrase, some of the language that you don't hear often today. And with that background, if you don't already know it, I think you'll appreciate it more. If you do already know it, my apologies. I know that whenever anyone talks about Chesterton, there will be in the room people who know more about Chesterton than he does. I'm sure that's the case here, so bear with me. The story, of course, is about the Battle of Lepanto, which took place on October 7th, 1571. It was a decisive battle at a frightening time for Christian Europe, when the Turks, which means the Muslim Empire, the Ottoman Empire, was becoming more and more powerful, more and more threatening, had made inroads into Europe. Under Suleiman the Magnificent had advanced as far as Vienna in 1529 before being repulsed there. And after that had not lost any significant battles between 1529 and, let's say, 1565. They were in the ascendant. Meanwhile, Christian Europe was fractured by the Reformation, the religious wars, and was crumbling from lack of unity. The Selim II had succeeded Suleiman the Magnificent and was doing what he was expected to do as the head of this Islamic empire, which was expand. He was bound to expand into Europe. He had been harassing Europe, particularly Italy. Now, understand, of course, Italy at the time is a place, not a nation. There's Genoa, there's Venice, there's the Papal States, and they are, each one is not strong enough to withstand. Venice is probably the strongest. Venice tried to make a deal with the Turks. The deal fell apart. The Turks broke it. They attacked Malta in 1565 and were not successful in taking Malta, but came back and took Cyprus in 1570. Now, as they're expanding, they're strengthening, they're making raids up and down Italy, and with each raid they get stronger and more threatening. Pope Pius V, a great pope, a saintly pope, St. Pius V, one of the reforming popes after the Reformation and after a rather unfortunate succession of popes before him for a while. Pope Pius V tried to rally the European Christian kingdoms to defend Christendom without success for a long time. He was convinced, probably rightly, that within a year the Turks would take Rome. Rome was their objective. The red apple, they called it, and they were arming to take Rome. A bit about how they fought. They were mostly a naval force. They fought in huge war galleys. This was at a time there were cannon, but the cannon weren't very accurate. They were mostly, really, land battles fought on sea. That is, the galleys would come together, they would crash into each other, they had battering rams, and then the soldiers would pour off the decks onto the deck of the other and slaughter each other. It was very bloody. They were sailing ships, but they were also powered by galleys of slave labor with oars. And each time you won a naval battle, one of the things you did is you captured the other side and you put them to work chained in the galleys, if you didn't kill them. Notice that if you have what is really, I suppose, a marine force skilled in hand-to-hand combat, you can go to shore and invade. So it's not just a naval war. These are a marine force. The other thing, of course, is that when you capture someone, some other boat or some city, some town, you force them to take tribute. So as the Turkish force was sailing around the Mediterranean, these ships, which were on long, long voyages, were collecting a lot of silver and gold, as well as slaves. Okay, with that background, in 1571, in March of 1571, Pope Pius finally managed to put together an alliance which he called the Holy League, consisting of Spain, Venice, and the Papal States primarily. And he put in charge of it Don Juan of Austria. Now, Chesterton refers to him as Don John, perhaps because he doesn't like the Spanish, and perhaps because he doesn't want you to be confused with the Don Juan who Mozart made famous for different reasons that are not entirely what we want to talk about tonight. I am going to just call him Don John because I don't want to confuse myself. Don John was the illegitimate son of Charles V, was it Charles IV? Fifth, of Austria. And therefore the half-brother of Philip of Spain. Because he was illegitimate, couldn't be a king. He was noble, but not royal. There was tension between Don John and Philip throughout their lives. The extent of that tension is a matter of historical debate, and we'll get into that a little bit. Don John had been in Spain fighting the Moriscos, who were Muslim rebels, leading the fight, successfully putting down that rebellion, which was critical to the health of Spain. So he had military background and a successful military background. He was regarded as a good military leader. He was dashing, he was brave, he was athletic, he was reputed to be a very good dancer. He was just cool. And he had a presence. Obviously, the Pope Pius saw in him the leader that he needed to put together this coalition. He formed a fleet and sailed out in search of the Turks and found them at anchor in Greece and the Gulf of Lepanto, which is near the Gulf of Corinth. And that's where the battle began. The correlation of forces here was forbidding. To put it in very round figures, the Turks had 300 war galleys, the Christians had 200. The Turks had 100,000 men at arms. The Christians had 20,000 men at arms, plus a lot of rowers who were eventually given arms, but nowhere near the same number. It looked grim. There was no reason to expect a Christian victory, no reason on earth. And for that reason, Pope Pius sought help elsewhere. He ordered all of Christians of Europe to pray the Rosary for the success of this venture. He ordered a plenary indulgence to the soldiers who, if they fell in battle against the Turks. He put priests on every ship. As they advanced towards Lepanto, the priests heard the confessions of everyone who was on board, gave communion to everyone the day of the battle, walked around the deck giving blessings to the soldiers, the sailors. It was said to be very quiet on the Christian line of battle as they approached, very noisy on the Turkish side. They're cheering and screaming. Don Juan, as the battle became, as they approached the battle line, took a little boat and went from ship to ship with a crucifix, reminding people what they were fighting for. It was very clearly, in their mind, a religious battle, a crusade. A funny thing, an ironic thing, when they formed for battle, formed the battle lines, the Christians had a long line of ships with a few out in front and then a rear guard. You look at it from the side and it looks like a cross. The Turks, who had many more ships, made them into a sort of U-shape, or if you prefer, a crescent. So you have the crescent and the cross. And oddly enough, this, well, I'll get to that later. The crescent and the cross facing off. Ali Pasha, the Turkish commander, took the lead, which is unusual. You wouldn't expect that. Usually the leader would be safely in the rear a little bit, as did Don Juan, the two flagships heading right at each other. Long before he got within cannon range, Don Juan ordered a shot taken at Ali Pasha's ship, just sort of a challenge. It is said that before the battle began, Don Juan, I'm supposed to be saying Don John. Don John was dancing on the prow of the ship. He was so excited. You know, the joie de combat is just, I'm sure you could explain it as a burst of adrenaline, but I think when you're going to be, just speaking from my misspent youth, when you have a time you're about to be in a fight, there's also, it's a thrill. You know, just the excitement of this, here we go. I also need to say, because it comes up later, he was standing on the poop deck, just so you know, that is a naval term. That's now, as the battle began, the Christians, who were vastly outnumbered, were rowing and sailing, well, trying to sail, against a heavy wind, which made it almost impossible for them to maneuver, gave a huge advantage to the Turks, who didn't need any advantage. Just before they clashed, the wind suddenly shifted 180 degrees. The Christians had the wind behind them. The Turks had to take their sails down. This was the miracle that they had been praying for. Everyone thought it was a miracle at the time. Everyone saw it as a sign from God. Back in Rome, Pope Pius had had a vision that morning. Before, obviously, he had checked his email. He couldn't have known what was happening. And his vision was of a crescent and a cross, the ships in a crescent, in the form of a crescent and a cross. And there is in the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican a painting. It's not a painting. It's a representation of. Is it a painting? It's not a painting. It's a painting. That it sort of exaggerates, but it has the crescent and the cross. It's the vision of Pope Pius, and he had a vision that it was going to be a victory, and it was. And as I say, everybody at the time thought it was a miracle. They knew that they should not have won by any natural means, but they did. Not to diminish the miracle, there were a few reasons in the natural order. There were innovations that Don John introduced. The first was he had that small sort of skirmishing force of ships out in front of the main line. And what the Turks didn't know, because it hadn't been done before, is that those ships had cannons lined up for a broadside. This was not done in naval warfare before. And it changed naval warfare, because from then on, naval warfare was a matter of lining up cannons and taking shots at each other. That did heavy damage to the Turks before the battle, the proper began. Second, I told you that they would ram each other and then jump on board and fight. Andrea Doria, who was one of the admirals of the Christian fleet, had figured out that the heavy rods that they used as battering rams were interfering with the aiming of the cannon, so that you would crash into the other ship, you would aim your cannon at the other deck, and the shot would go up into the sheets. It wouldn't do any damage. When you took the rams off, you could aim the cannon down, and you could do carnage on deck, which the Christians did. Finally, something that you'd think somebody would have thought of before, they put nets on the sides of the ships to interfere with people trying to climb on. That hadn't been done before. This was the last battle of its sort because of those innovations. The naval warfare was different from then on. What happened? The extent of the Christian victory is mind-boggling. There were about 7,000 Christians lost in the battle, 30,000 Turks, 12 Christian galleys ruined, 200 Turkish galleys. And not just the galleys, but the officers on them. So that the Turkish fleet was destroyed and was no longer a threat for a very long time. It was because of this that Pope Pius V ordered the next year that the anniversary would be celebrated as the Feast of Our Lady of Victory. It was later changed to our Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary. And that's the story of the battle. Now, a little bit about the poem. Just by the way, if you're very interested and you haven't seen it before, this book, Lepanto, it's edited by Dale Ahlquist and available from Ignatius Press, and it tells you everything that I'm going to tell you, so I hope you haven't read it. But after tonight, you can go buy a copy. I want to run through some of the poem, just tell you some of the things about it. There's wonderful wordplay that I don't need to explain to you, the alliteration, the assonance, just the sonority of the poem, the very mellifluous phrases that you really need to hear. But there's some unfamiliar language, and there's some concepts, and there are also some ideas that I want to introduce to you. So if you'll bear with me before I get to the main event. He begins with the image of the Sultan in the Golden Horn, the capital of Islam. And he's at his ease, and he's very happy. And it begins, white founts falling in the courts of the sun. Now, it's just a nice phrase, white founts falling. And it sounds nice, and it sticks in your head, and it sets a mood. But as I read it for the umpteenth time, I said, you know, the funny thing is, it's in the nature of a fountain to shoot up, right? Fountains don't fall. The remarkable thing about a fountain is that the water goes up. When water is up, it will come down. Gravity is very reliable that way. But so he's saying something that's falling. Interesting. And it is the part at which a fountain is most beautiful, is where that arc, where the water starts to fall. But he's saying something's falling. Hold that thought. He talks about how the Sultan is very happy because of his forces, which have dared the white republics up the capes of Italy and dashed the Adriatic around the Lion of the Sea. That's Venice. And the Pope is looking for help with the Christian kings, and the cold Queen of England is looking in the glass. That's Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, known for being unmarried and speaking about marriage occasionally, but always in a political vein, very cold and calculating, and Protestant. The shadow of the Valois is yawning at the Mass. That's Charles IX of France. He's the shadow of the Valois. He became king, I think he was 10. And so his mother, Catherine de' Medici, who was the Duchess of Valois, was the governor. And so he's the shadow of the Valois, a man of not great consequence in Chesterton's mind. From Evening Isle's fantastical rings faint the Spanish gun. That's a reference to the fact that Spain is busy conquering the New World. They're in the Caribbean. They're far away. They're not concentrating enough. He doesn't even mention what we now call Germany. They're too busy with their own religious wars to be even a factor, and they were not much of a factor here. He then brings us to, he introduces Don John, rising from a doubtful seat and half attainted stall. Great little play on words, half attainted, half attained, half tainted. He makes it half attainted. The last knight of Europe takes weapons from the wall. The lost and lingering troubadour to whom the word has sung that once went singing southward when all the world was young. Now there I stop and I say, what is the timeline here? The world was young at the time of the Crusades. It's no longer young at the time of the Battle of Lepanto 400 years later. And this is from the perspective of somebody writing early in the 20th century. It doesn't add up, right? It wasn't that much younger. So what world is it that he's alluding to, right? He's not talking about the world since Adam and Eve. He's talking about something else, okay? Hold that thought. Then he talks about Don John riding to the war. And he moves to talk about Mahound. That's Muhammad, a somewhat disrespectful name for Muhammad, who is at his ease in paradise, but not really at his ease, because he sees something coming. He has a sense. And he conjures up all of the creatures, natural and supernatural, under his power. Black Azrael and Ariel and Ammon on the wing, giants and the genii, multiplex of wing and eye, whose strong obedience broke the sky when Solomon was king. There's a story in Muslim lore that Solomon, who was regarded as a Muslim, that Solomon had a ring on which was inscribed by Allah the power, gave him the power to command the genii and Black Azrael and all of these creatures. By the way, notice this is, it's a fascinating little thing that you find in Islam and you find in Plato's Republic and you find in Tolkien, rings with inscriptions on them that give you special power. So he had special powers. And he invokes them, and then Chesterton describes them, the various nefarious forces that are being gathered from temples where the yellow gods shut up their eyes in scorn. That's sort of a shot at Asian religions, the Buddha who sits there impassive, doesn't care, shuts up his eyes in scorn. They rise in green robes roaring from the green hells of the sea. Well, traditionally, Lucifer was struck down into the sea by Saint Michael, right? So these are rising from the seas where fallen skies and evil hues and eyeless creatures be. And he, Mahound, instructs these people, these forces, break up the mountains where the hermit folks may hide. That's monasteries. Be careful. And sift the red and silver sand like lest bone of saint abide. That's relics. Be very careful. And chase the Jowers flying. Jowers are non-Muslims. I think Jowers are what Muslims say, where Jews would call it us the Goyim. And he sees this because he sees the crusade. He sees this as a crusade, as does Chesterton, coincidentally. He sees Richard and Raymond and Godfrey at the gate. Those are the crusader leaders, the successful crusaders. Godfrey was chosen king of Jerusalem and refused to take the title because he said there's only one king of Jerusalem. And then Chesterton, he bounces around. And he bounces around to Saint Michael, who defeated Lucifer, to Mont Saint-Michel, the great church on an island off the coast of Spain. And he has Saint Michael the Archangel sending an alarm, and nobody's listening. Nobody's listening because they're too busy in Northern Europe with the religious wars. And he goes on, Chesterton goes on to say, dead is all the innocence of anger and surprise. He's saying anger and surprise is what he saw with the Reformation, that there was reason to be angry. There was reason to be surprised with the corruption in the church. But that's all gone now, and it's just an empty, stultifying religious debate. And Christian dreadeth Christ that hath a newer face of doom, predestination. And Christian hateth Mary that God kissed in Galilee. Then he bounces to Spain. And I'm going to say, if there's one thing that I don't like about this poem, well, there's two things. The one thing I don't like, he's kind of rough on poor King Philip. It's not just that he shares my name. He wasn't named after me. He's in his closet with a fleece about his neck. That's the golden fleece, which is the symbol of the Habsburg Empire. Chesterton's very rough on King Philip, and I think too much so, because, well, there's a wonderful, big, massive tome by the historian William Walsh about King Philip, and Walsh probably errs in the other direction. He thinks Philip is a great saint, but he is pretty convincing that what Philip did, most of what he did because he wanted to save Christendom. He wanted to reunite Christendom. Toward that end, he offered to marry Queen Elizabeth, which is considerable sacrifice. But Chesterton doesn't like King Philip. And he's probably affected by the Black Legend, which goes around England and is very anti-Spanish. King Philip did send the Armada to England, and I guess they were a little sore about that. And he alludes to the fact that the Spanish court at that time was served by dwarves. They hired them as servants. And he talks about that a little bit. And then he alludes to, he has King Philip holding a vial in his hand, a vial of poison. And that is reference to the rumor that King Philip eventually poisoned Don John. Don John did die suddenly, and King Philip probably didn't like him. But the idea that he was poisoned is without much historical foundation, but there is that rumor. Anyway, he's rough on King Philip for not being involved. And then he bounces to the Pope in his chapel, having that vision. He sees as in a mirror on the monstrous twilight sea. That's the vision that he had. Finally, he gets to the battle itself, and he talks a little bit first about the Christians who are slaves rowing in the galleys in the Turkish fleet. They are lost like slaves that swat. It's past tense of sweat. And in the skies of morning hung the stairways of the tallest gods, the pyramids, right? The ziggurats that were built by slaves when tyranny was young. And that really brings us to the end, the climax of the story, which you will hear. But then there's a funny anticlimax. Cervantes fought at Lepanto with distinction and was severely wounded and lost the use of his left arm. And he has a little stanza about Cervantes tacked onto the end of the poem. And you might ask yourself, why? And he concludes the poem by saying that Cervantes, he has this image that Cervantes, while he's on his galley on his way home, has the idea for Don Quixote. And he smiles, but not his sultan smile. It's not a smile of arrogance, it's a smile of joy in creation. But why? And here I'm going to try to tie up the ends that I've been leaving stringy here. I think that there's an undercurrent here. The last line of the poem is, "But Don John of Austria rides home from the crusade." There's an allusion to the crusade again. And remember how I said there's something falling at the beginning of the poem. And a little later, there's that when the world was young, when all the world was young. And I say, what is that world that's young? I think it's the world of Christendom. I think more particularly it's the world of chivalry. It's the world of the Crusades. It was young at the time of the first Crusades. It was old by the time of Lepanto. And remember, there's that, he gives that note. He gives you that hint that the last night of Europe, this is the last night on the last crusade. Something's over now. A new world has begun, for better or worse. I said there were two things that I don't like about the poem. Now I'm going to tell you the other thing. What's missing? Now I hope those of you who know the poem will agree that I was more or less accurate in my summary of it, my recap. What's missing from it? What's missing from this poem that we recite on the feast of Our Lady of the Rosary? Our Lady of the Rosary. There is only one passing mention to Our Lady. There is no mention of the Rosary. There is no mention of prayer. There's only a fleeting reference to God. It's a poem written about a supernatural event, but written in the natural order. It's a poem that seems on the face of it to be all about bravery, all about a triumph of chivalry, all about a win for Christendom. The faith is there. It's implicit. That's why the Christian fighters, their loss is laughter when they deem the wager worth. But it's all implicit. And I wonder if that's a strength or a weakness of this, that it's all implicit there. It makes it easy for us, if we have the faith, to appreciate it because it's there for us before we begin. I wonder about the effect on others who don't see it. And that's the second thing that I see as just an odd thing. There's no doubt in my mind and that Chesterton loves Our Lady. If you read it, you can sort of feel it, and yet he doesn't talk about her. It's just an oddment. And that's all I have to say about the poem. Let me just wet my whistle a bit, and then you can hear it. Later.
I had it waiting for you.
White founts falling in the courts of the sun, and the Sultan of Byzantium is smiling as they run. There is laughter like the fountains in that face of all men feared. It stirs the forest darkness, the darkness of his beard. It curls the blood-red crescent, the crescent of his lips. For the inmost sea of all the earth is shaken with his ships. They have dared the white republics up the capes of Italy. They have dashed the Adriatic round the lion of the sea. And the Pope has cast his arms abroad in agony and loss and called the kings of Christendom for arms above the cross. The cold Queen of England is looking in the glass. The shadow of the Valois is yawning at the Mass. From evening isles fantastical rings faint the Spanish gun, and the Lord upon the golden horn is laughing in the sun. Dim drums throbbing as the guns move far. Dim drums throbbing in the hills half heard, where only on a nameless throne a crownless prince has stirred, where, rising from a doubtful seat and half a tainted stall, the last knight of Europe takes weapons from the wall. The last and lingering troubadour to whom the bird had sung that once went singing southward when all the world was young. In that immortal silence, tiny and unafraid, comes up along the winding road the noise of a crusade. Strong gongs droning as the guns boom far, Don John of Austria is going to the war. Stiff flags straining in the night blast cold, in the gloom dark purple, black purple, in the glint old gold, torchlight crimson on the copper kettle brims, then the tuckets, then the trumpets, then the cannons, then he comes. Don John smiling in the brave beard curled, spurning of his stirrups like the thrones of all the world, holding his head high as a flag for all the free. Love light of Spain, hurrah, death light of Africa. Don John of Austria is riding to the sea. Mahound is in his paradise above the evening star. Don John of Austria is riding to the war. He moves a mighty turban on the timeless Ori's knee, a turban that is woven of the sunset and the sea. He shakes the peacock gardens as he rises from his ease, and he strides among the treetops and is taller than the trees. And his voice in all that garden is a thunder set to bring black Azrael and Ariel and Ammon on the wing, giants in the genii multiplex of wing and eye, whose strong obedience broke the sky when Solomon was king. They rise in red robes roaring from the red. They rush in red and purple from the red skies of the dawn, from temples where the yellow gods shut up their eyes in scorn. They rush in green robes roaring from the green hells of the sea, where fallen dreams, fallen skies, and evil hues, and eyeless creatures be. They swell in sapphire smoke out of the blue cracks in the ground, and they gather, and they wonder, and give worship to Mahound. And he saith, break up the mountains where the hermit folk may hide, and sift the red and silver sands, lest bone of saint abide. and send the jowers flying night and day, not giving rest, for that which was our trouble comes again out of the west. We have set our seal of Solomon on all things under sun, of knowledge and endurance, and of sorrow and endurance of things done. But a noise is in the mountains, and I know that voice that shook our palaces 400 years ago. It is he who saith not Kismet. It is he who knows not fate. It is Richard, it is Raymond, it is Godfrey in the gate. It is he whose loss is laughter when he counts the wager worth. Set down your feet upon him, that our peace may be on earth. For he heard the guns groaning, and he heard the gongs groaning, and he heard the guns jar. Don John of Austria is going to the war. Excuse me, this is just in time. Thank you very much. Sudden and still, hurrah. Bolt from Iberia, hurrah. Don John of Austria is gone by Alcalar. St. Michael's in his mountain, in the sea roads of the north, Don John of Austria is girt and going forth. Where the gray seas glitter and the sharp tides shift, and the sea folks labor and the red sails lift. He shakes his lance of iron, and he claps his wings of stone. The noise is gone through Normandy, the noise is gone alone. The north is full of tangled things and texts and aching eyes, and dead is all the innocence of anger and surprise. And Christian killeth Christian in a narrow dusty room, and Christian hateth Christ, who hath a newer face of doom, and Christian hateth Mary, whom God kissed in Galilee. But Don John of Austria is riding through the sea, Don John calling through the blast and the eclipse, crying with his trumpet, the trumpet of his lips, trumpet that saith, Ha, Domino Gloria, Don John of Austria is shouting to the ships. King Philip's in his closet with the fleece about his neck. Don John of Austria is armed upon the deck. The walls are hung with satin that are black and soft as sin, and little dwarfs creep out of it, and little dwarfs creep in. He holds a phial in his hand. He holds a crystal phial that has colors like the moon, and he touches, and it tingles, and he trembles very soon. And his face is as a fungus of a leprous white and green, like gray, like plants in the high houses that are hidden from the day. And death is in that phial, and the end of noble work. But Don John of Austria has fired upon the Turk. Don John hunting, and his hounds have bayed. Booms away across Italy the noise of his crusade. Gun upon gun, hurrah! Gun upon gun, hurrah! Don John of Austria has loosed the cannonade. The Pope was in his chapel before day or battle broke. Don John of Austria is hidden in the smoke. That secret room in a man's house where God sits all the year, that hidden window whence the world looks small and very dear, he sees, as in a mirror on the monstrous twilight sea, the vision of his cruel ships whose name is Mystery. They fling great shadows forward, making cross and crescent dark, cross and castle dark. They veil the plumed lions on the galleys of St. Mark, and above the ships are palaces with brown, black-bearded chiefs, and below the ships are prisons where, with multitudinous griefs, Christian captives, sick and sunless, all a laboring race repine, like a race in sunken cities, like a people in a mine. They are lost, like slaves that swat, and in the skies of morning hung the stairways of the tallest gods when tyranny was young. They are countless, voiceless, hopeless, as those fallen are fleeing on before the high king's horses in the granite of Babylon. And many a one grows witless in his private room in hell as a yellow face looks inward through the lattice of his cell. And he finds his God forgotten, and he seeks no more a sign. But Don John of Austria has burst the battle line, Don John pounding through the slaughter-painted poop, purpling of the ocean like a bloody pirate sloop, scarlets running over on the silvers and the gold, bursting of the hatches up and breaking of the holds, thronging of the thousands up who labored under sea, stunned for joy and blind for sun and stunned for liberty. Vivat Hispania, Domino Gloria, Don John of Austria has set his people free. Cervantes, on his galley, puts his sword back in his sheath. Don John of Austria rides homeward with a wreath. He sees across a weary land a straggling road in Spain, up which a lean and foolish knight forever rides in vain. And he smiles, but not his sultan smile, and settles back the blade. But Don John of Austria rides home from his crusade.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was just wonderful. A couple of things. We will have some refreshments for everyone now, and in a little over half an hour we will have night prayer, and you're all invited to join us for night prayer in our chapel. And I think that's everything. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.